And when it was determined that we should sail into Italy, they delivered Paul and certain other prisoners unto one named Julius, a centurion of Augustus' band. Here Paul began his eventful trip to Rome. Before this, he had already been in prison over 2 years, and once in Rome, he remained in prison for at least another 2 years. This trip took at least 6 months, so Paul was under arrest about 5 years. And entering into a ship of Andromateum we launched, meaning to sail by the coasts of Asia, one Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, being with us. Adramyttium was the home port of the ship Paul sailed on from Caesarea. It was located almost 50 miles southeast of Troas. And the next day we touched at Sidon, and Julius courteously entreated Paul and gave him liberty to go into his friends to refresh himself. This certainly wasn't normal for a Roman soldier to allow his prisoner to leave under his own personal recognizance. If Paul had escaped, Julius' life could have been at risk. This is a powerful testimony as to the type of person Paul was. People trusted him. It is also a testimony to the type of person Julius was. And when we had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. The ship was intended to sail north of this route along the coast of Asia, but a contrary wind blew them far south, so they went south of the island of Cyprus. When we had sailed over the sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. And there the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. This ship was from Alexandria in Egypt. We later find it was carrying wheat. And when we had sailed slowly many days and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering, we sailed under Crete, over against Salmone. Crete is an island in the Mediterranean Sea, south of the Aegean Sea. Salmone was the name of a rock outcropping on the extreme eastern end of the island of Crete in the Mediterranean Sea today, and hardly passing it came unto a place which is called the Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lycia. Fair Havens was the name of a port on the southeastern side of the island of Crete. It was here that Paul admonished the centurion in charge of the ship to winter, but his advice was refused. Now when much time was spent, and when sailing now was dangerous, because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. The fast being referred to is the Day of Atonement. It was on the 10th day of the 7th month, or about October 1st. After this time, the Mediterranean became dangerous to navigate. And said unto them, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading and ship, but also of our lives. Paul didn't make any reference to this being something the Lord told him. In just natural wisdom, it was not safe to sail at that time of the year. So it isn't clear if this was Paul's own wisdom or the wisdom of God. Indeed, God used our wisdom at times to speak to us. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken by Paul. From this verse, it looks like the centurion was in control of this voyage, not the owner of the ship. The centurion, Julius, had shown favor and respect for Paul, but he made a distinction between his trust for Paul's moral character and his judgment about matters of sailing. And because the haven was not commodious to winter in, the more part advised to depart then also, if by any means that they might attain to Phoenice, and there to winter, which is in haven of Crete, and lie toward the southwest and northwest. The apparent harmony is that this verse is speaking of the winds when it mentions southwest and northwest. The southwest winds would facilitate a ship leaving through the northeast opening, and likewise, a northwest wind would aid a ship to sail through the southeast opening to the sea. And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence, they sailed close by Crete. This was a dangerous time of the year to be sailing the Mediterranean Sea. Paul had warned them not to sail, but his advice was rejected. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind called Euroclydon. This is what storms on the Mediterranean were called. Today they are called Gregali. This would correspond to a typhoon or hurricane. And when the ship was caught and could not bear up into the wind, we let her drive. Just like this ship, once we leave the safety of doing what the Lord instructs us to do, we experience forces that drive us to do things we don't want to do. Our only true protection is to stay right in the center of God's will. And running under a certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. The boat being spoken of is considered by most scholars to be a small lifeboat that ships like these towed behind them in the wake of the ship, which when they had taken up, they used helps ungirding the ship, and fearing lest that they should fall into the quicksand, strake sail, and so were driven. In a storm such as this, it is certain that the sails had already been lowered. Therefore, most scholars believe this refers to the removal of the mast to which of the sails were attached, so that the structure of the ship would not be weakened by the working of the mast. And we, being exceedingly tossed with the tempest, the next day they lightened the ship. They lighten the ship by throwing things overboard. Likewise, when we disobey God, we get caught up in the tempest we create for ourselves and often lose things that are dear to us. And the third day we cast out with our own hands the tackling of the ship. They threw overboard everything that they deemed not necessary. This testifies to the seriousness of their situation. They wouldn't have done this unless they feared for their lives. And when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was then taken away. What is hope? It is positive imagination. This is saying that the imagination on the inside of these people turned from positive to negative. They lost sight of deliverance in their imaginations and only saw themselves dying. But after long abstinence, Paul stood forth in the midst of them and said, Sirs, ye should have hearkened unto me, and have not loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss. There are different reasons we experience storms in our lives. This storm that Paul found himself in wasn't his fault. He had warned the people against sailing. When we are in a storm of other people's making, we need to intercede for them, as Paul did here, and use our authority. And now I exhort you to be of good cheer, for there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, but of the ship. Jonah said Nineveh would be destroyed in 40 days. He didn't prophesy anything about that judgment being averted if they repented. But when the people humbled themselves, God did not destroy them. So, whether stated or not, conditions often apply to true God-given prophecies. For there stood by me this night the angel of God, whose I am and whom I serve. By many standards, Paul was a lowly prisoner on this ship with 276 souls. But God didn't send his angel to the centurion or the captain of the ship or any other person of influence. The angel appeared to Paul because of his relationship with the Lord, saying, Fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Nearly 40 times in Scripture, the Lord spoke to people saying, Fear not. Wherefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. When we truly believe God, we will always be of good cheer. Faith is simply believing what God has told us, to the point that we act accordingly. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. The Lord did not choose to give the name of the island to Paul, although he certainly could have. Many times, this is the case when receiving instructions from the Lord. He gives us generalities with the details omitted. But when the 14th night was come, as we were driven up and down in Adria, about midnight the shipmen deemed that they drew near to some country. This was apparently the 14th night since the storm hit. Luke mentioned that on the third day of the storm, they cast out the tackling of the ship. Paul started his fast sometime after the storm began, and he ended it before his 14th night. And sounded and found it 20 fathoms, and when they had gone a little further, they sounded again and found it 15 fathoms. A fathom was the distance from the tip of the fingers of one hand to the tip of the fingers of the other hand, with the arms extended. Then, fearing lest we should have fallen upon rocks, they cast 4 anchors out of the stern and wished for the day. The crew had already lightened the ship and thrown out most of the tackling of the ship. It was prudent that they hadn't gotten rid of these anchors. And as the shipmen were about to flee out of the ship, when they had let down the boat into the sea, under color as though they would have cast anchors out of the foreship, the use of the definite article "the" in front of boat reveals this was the only lifeboat they had. Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, Except these abide in the ship, ye cannot be saved. The selfishness of a few could have sunk the whole ship. This is so true in many applications. The Lord had already promised Paul that everyone would be saved. That was a word from the Lord, and Paul delivered it as a prophecy. But here he said that if these sailors escaped in this boat, it would void the prophecy. This clearly shows that not all prophecies from the Lord automatically come to pass. We have to cooperate to see their fulfillment. Then the soldiers cut off the ropes of the boat, and let her fall off. Paul had gained the respect of the centurion and the other Roman soldiers through his ability to hear from God. They had ignored him once, but they would not make that mistake again. The manifestation of God's power in his life had exalted Paul from prisoner to commander. And while the day was coming on, Paul besought them all to take meat, saying, "This day is the 14th day that ye have tarried and continued fasting, having taken nothing." It's amazing these sailors had the strength to do anything. They must have been in very good shape. Wherefore I pray you to take some meat, for this is for your health, for there shall not an hair fall from the head of any of you. This was quite a promise in such a dangerous situation, but Paul believed the Lord completely. And when he had thus spoken, he took bread and gave thanks to God in presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. They were still in a terrible situation. They weren't out of trouble by any means, but Paul was in faith, and his faith lifted the spirits of everyone on board. Faith is contagious. Then were they all of good cheer, and they also took some meat. This is amazing. I understand completely why Paul was of good cheer. Here he had a relationship with the Lord, and he trusted the promises the Lord had given him. But the others were of good cheer because of their faith in what Paul believed. And we were all in the ship, 203 score and 16 souls. This is a big ship with 276 people on board. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and cast out the wheat into the sea. This was the third time they had taken measures to lighten the ship. This was done to get the ship as high in the water as possible so they could move it as close to land as possible. And when it was day, they knew not the land, but they discovered a certain creek with a shore, into the which they were minded, if it were possible, to thrust in the ship. There is a place on Malta that fits this description. It has long been the traditional spot where the Apostle Paul was shipwrecked. It is called St. Paul's Island and lies in St. Paul's Bay. Their willingness to run the ship aground showed the desperation of their situation. They had despaired of life and were willing to sacrifice anything for a chance to live. And when they had taken up the anchors, they committed themselves into the sea and loosed the rudder bands and hoisted up the mainsail to the wind and made toward shore. Loosed the rudder bands means they took the restraints off the rudders, which allowed them to fall back into the water and provide some steering of the boat. And falling into a place where two seas met, they ran the ship aground, and the forepart stuck fast and remained unmovable, but the hinder part was broken with the violence of the waves. This testifies to how severe the storm was. And the soldiers' counsel was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim out and escape. It was a Roman custom to kill the jailer if he let his prisoners escape. This was why they wanted to kill the prisoners. Notice this verse says they were prisoners. Paul was not the only prisoner on the ship. But the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land. Paul had found favor with the captors because of the manifest blessing of God in his life. Here, the centurion was risking his life to save Paul's. Proverbs 16:7 says, "When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him," although not stated in Scripture. It is very probable that this centurion who put his life on the line for Paul's sake also embraced the gospel Paul preached and later used his influence to obtain a private house for Paul to be kept in. And the rest, some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship, and so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. We know that this deliverance was definitely of God, yet there was no supernatural intervention. The storm was not miraculously calmed as Jesus had done, and the boat was not instantly transported to some safe haven as had happened with the disciples. God delivered them, true to his promise, but in a natural way.